It is April 11th, 1912. The RMS Titanic has been steaming from Cherbourg, France, bound for Queenstown, Ireland, since last night. Now, the Titanic is due to arrive in Cherbourg at some point between 10 and 10:30 a.m. However, just like what we saw in Cherbourg, this is not going to be an extended stay for the Titanic. The Titanic is planning to do just a quick stop in Queenstown, Ireland to drop off passengers and cargo and pick up more passengers and cargo, and then turn around and head back out to sea as quickly as possible. Now, in the hours leading up to the Titanic's arrival in Queenstown, some evidence was discovered that shows something pretty interesting was going on with the ship as it was approaching Queenstown. This photograph, taken by our favorite Titanic photographer, Father Brown, shows this very interesting wake coming off of the back of the Titanic, which seems to show that the Titanic was in a state of turning. Now, this photograph was taken far too early to be caused by the Titanic's approach to Queenstown. So what this photograph suggests is that in the hours leading up to the ship's arrival, the Titanic's crew, for whatever reason, decided to do some maneuverability tests with the Titanic. So it looks like they were just simply having the Titanic perform these sharp turns and just move around and everything just to see how the ship was performing. A short time later, the Titanic was finally arriving in Queenstown. Now, just like what we saw in Cherbourg, this was not going to be an extended stay for the Titanic. The Titanic was simply going to steam into Queenstown, drop off and pick up more passengers and cargo, and then turn around and head back out to sea as quickly as possible. Now, as the Titanic approached Queenstown and steamed into the harbor, the Titanic, just like what we saw in Cherbourg, did not go all the way up to the Queenstown dock. Instead, what happened was the ship simply stopped out in the harbor, and then Queenstown sent two small tender boats, the American and the Ireland, out to the Titanic, and these tender boats picked up and dropped off passengers and cargo and so on and so forth, just like what we saw in Cherbourg with the Nomadic and the Traffic. Now, around 200 passengers boarded the Titanic while it was in Queenstown, and a very, very small number of passengers left the Titanic. I'm not sure the exact number, but it was very, very small. Oh, and I did find that one crewman actually left the Titanic in Queenstown. It was a fireman, and from what I could find, it seems like his name was John Coffey, and it looks like John Coffey performed one of the greatest psychs in maritime history. Essentially, what happened with John Coffey was he signed on to work on board the Titanic throughout its entire maiden voyage. But instead what he did was he simply worked as a fireman from Southampton to Queenstown, and then when the ship pulled into Queenstown, he was like, later, and hopped on one of those tender boats and went to Queenstown. He basically pranked the White Star Line to get free passage on the Titanic from Southampton to Queenstown. Another interesting person who left the Titanic in Queenstown, Ireland was our favorite Titanic photographer, Father Brown. Now, as Father Brown was leaving the Titanic, he by chance took another photo of the ship, and he actually captured the last known photograph of the Titanic's captain, Edward John Smith, looking over the Titanic's side at Father Brown's boat as it was pulling away from the ship. Now, I did make a very interesting video covering the story of Father Brown, and he has one of the most unique stories from the entire story of the Titanic. So if you would like to watch that video, and I would highly encourage you all to do so, I will include a link to that video in the description below. Now, the Titanic left Queenstown at roughly 11:30 a.m., around an hour or so after it arrived in Queenstown. Now, as the Titanic was steaming away, a good number of passengers on board the Titanic went to the very back of the ship, and they simply stood there and watched Queenstown disappear on the horizon as the Titanic was slowly but surely steaming away. What you have to remember is a good number of passengers that were on board the Titanic were immigrants who were leaving Ireland, their home, for America, and a good number of them thought that they would probably never return to Ireland. So I'm sure more than a few people on board the Titanic were feeling a little homesick. Now, speaking of feeling homesick, there was another man on board the Titanic who actually helped design the ship, and he was on board it for its maiden voyage to help troubleshoot the ship. Now, even though he would be returning to Ireland, Ireland was his home, he always felt homesick whenever he had to leave Ireland behind. This man's name was Thomas Andrews. Now, Thomas Andrews had served with a good number of people on board the Titanic before, including the Titanic's chief baker, Charles Yelkin. Now, where Charles had served with Andrews before, he knew that Thomas Andrews always felt a little homesick whenever he had to leave Ireland behind. So in order to help him out with this, Charles always tried to bake Thomas Andrews some Irish soda bread so he wouldn't feel quite as homesick whenever work took him far from home. Now, throughout the rest of the day, nothing too eventful happened. The only other thing of note that happened on April 11th was a good number of the Titanic's second-class passengers were unhappy with their cabins, so they went and complained quite loudly to the Titanic's purser, and he arranged to allow these passengers to simply change cabins. You have to remember the Titanic wasn't that fully booked, so it wasn't that big a deal for him to allow these people to shift cabins and everything. But once this was resolved, everything was pretty normal on board the Titanic. The ship was making good time, and everybody on board the ship was still settling in and getting ready for what they hoped would be a smooth sailing across the Atlantic. All right, everybody, well, hey, that covers the Titanic's second day on her maiden voyage. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure you leave it a like, and if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel, and make sure you tune in to the next episode as we continue the full story of the Titanic's maiden voyage. Thanks to our captain-level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.